I've spoken a lot in the past about the illegal immigration crisis at the US southern border, which has recently seen record numbers of illegals pouring into the USA. This news report from December last year gives just a little taste of the situation Americans face.
Multiple CBP sources telling me this morning in the last 24 hours, Border Patrol alone has made more than 10,000 apprehensions of illegal immigrants. That does not even include CBP ports of entry. And you can see the situation here in Lukeville behind us. We got well over 800 people waiting in line here after they crossed illegally overnight, waiting to be apprehended by Border Patrol. Once again, it's like deja vu from yesterday. You can see these guys are coming in from all over the world. A lot of African men, mostly single adult men here. Some of them were setting campfires overnight in the cold, camping out here, waiting to get taken into custody by Border Patrol. But CBP sources telling me in the last 24 hours in this Tucson, Arizona sector, there were almost 2,900 apprehensions, and the Border Patrol facilities out here are currently running 200% of their capacity. That is why there are so many people out here waiting to be taken into custody by Border Patrol.
Now, Australians, by and large, watch the illegal immigration situation not just in the USA, but also in the UK and Europe with bemusement. To us, this concept of open borders is as alien as it is nonsensical. How on earth does it make sense to tolerate random people from all over the globe forcibly entering the country outside of the legal ports of entry by not only allowing them in, but spending taxpayers' money feeding and housing them while their asylum claims are processed? Particularly when, as you heard from that report, most of these illegal immigrants are young, fighting-age men. Not that I have anything against young men, far from it. The difficulty there, though, is that the absence of women and children, that is, family groups, would indicate that these men are instead economic migrants. The difference between the two being that an asylum seeker is a person who has left their country and is seeking protection from persecution and serious human rights violations in another country, but who hasn't yet been legally recognised as a refugee and is waiting to receive a decision on their asylum claim. An economic migrant, however, is someone who leaves their home country for economic reasons, either to seek a better standard of living or to find work and send money home to their families. While this may, according to some, be a noble venture, the bottom line is that in order to live and work in another country, you need to qualify for a visa. You can't just jump the queue. Hence the fact a lot of economic migrants pretend to be asylum seekers in order to get in, often under instructions from people smugglers and human traffickers. These criminals promise economic migrants a better life in the West, take sometimes tens of thousands of dollars for them in fees for cross-border passage, only for the migrants to find a situation that is far from the paradise they were promised. It's a sorry situation, and Australia has, at least for the last decade or so, been largely immune to it. We are both renowned and reviled internationally, depending on who you ask, for our stringent immigration policies and zero-tolerance stance on illegal immigration. As the saying goes, we don't need a wall because we have a moat, and it's a very, very big one filled with sharks. That is, until a couple of weeks ago, when a group of about 40 illegal immigrants, all men, mostly from Pakistan or Bangladesh, arrived on the Australian mainland by boat off the coast of Western Australia and were found at a couple of locations.
Locals say it was the weirdest day in memory in the small bush community of Beagle Bay. The quiet Friday morning when an exhausted group of foreigners emerged from the bush, looking for water and looking for directions to Sydney.
We just had some visitors come on the boat. I'm not sure what boat is, but I just only heard this morning.
The ABC was tipped off by a resident and arrived before the federal authorities. 2 local police officers managing the situation as best they could. Staff from the local Aboriginal health clinic bandaged wounds and supplied cold water as the men contemplated their fate in the 40-degree heat.
And around the same time, a local Aboriginal tourism operator discovered 13 more men about 35 kilometres north of Beagle Bay, hiding behind a car. That completed the whole group, who are believed to have arrived on the same boat. They were quickly flown to Nauru Detention Centre for offshore processing.
39 men who arrived in remote Western Australia flown to Nauru after telling locals they'd travelled by boat from Indonesia.
The government needs to be honest and frank and open in relation to this issue. We don't know whether it's one or two boats that have arrived.
While the Prime Minister wouldn't say, a government source told the ABC Border Force believes all men came on one boat. Some were found in Beagle Bay, while others walked into the Pender Bay campsite, about 30 kilometres away.
It does emphasise just how exposed our vast northwest coast is, and that's why we need to continue to make sure we have the resources to protect that coast.
This boat arrival comes just 3 months after another people smuggling boat also successfully made it to the Australian mainland, carrying 12 men who were also sent to Nauru for processing. So what's the situation with these most recent arrivals? Well, as you heard, they told locals they wanted to get to Sydney, presumably to look for work. That would indicate they are economic migrants, not asylum seekers, which was confirmed during processing at Nauru Detention Centre. They are unlikely to be granted refugee status and will likely be sent back to their own countries. A number of them have already elected to leave of their own accord. Now, you foreigners watching this program might now be thinking, so what? Only about 62 local boat arrivals, total boat arrivals making it to the mainland since November last year? Well, that sounds like a win when you consider the situation in other countries. But the thing is, Australia is not like other countries. As I mentioned, Australia doesn't have a wall, we have a moat, and that moat is unbelievably dangerous to cross. And just over 10 years ago, thanks to the then Labor government's disastrous, bleeding heart policies on illegal boat arrivals, we saw the full scale of what happens when a country like Australia lapses in its border policies, and the results were simply tragic. Hence the fact illegal maritime arrivals, as they are officially called, is such a red-hot issue in Australian politics. So, here's a brief history of Australia's recent immigration policy. In the early 2000s, under the John Howard coalition government, Australia employed what was called the Pacific Solution. This entailed boat arrivals being sent to offshore processing centres on islands like Nauru and also Christmas Island, rather than being settled in the Australian community. And it was a largely effective strategy. The number of boat arrivals remained relatively low. Offshore detention instead of settlement is, after all, a nice deterrent from making that dangerous sea voyage. Then came the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd Labor government era of 2007 to 2013. In 2008, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd made what is arguably the dumbest decision an Australian Prime Minister has ever made, which was to abolish the Pacific Solution, then close the Nauru Detention Centre, abolish temporary protection visas, and allow illegal boat arrivals to remain in the community while their visa situation was being determined, if they supposedly posed no threat, all with a mind to giving them permanent residency. Now, as you can imagine, this opened the floodgates and the boats came streaming in. To give you one example, while only 25 asylum seekers had travelled by boat to Australia in the 2008 to 2009 financial year, over 5,000 people arrived during 2009 to 2010. And remember, this isn't a simple matter of slinking over a land border. This is a dangerous sea voyage on often dilapidated boats, and as a result, of the 50,000 people who came illegally by boat between 2008 and 2013, 1,200 men, women and children drowned at sea. This came into the consciousness of all Australians with the tragic sinking of a refugee boat on the coast of Christmas Island in 2010.
The outstretched hand of a woman grasping for life as frantic rescuers try to drag survivors from the boiling sea.
We need to get life jackets down to these people.
This was the refugee boat just seconds before it was swamped by huge waves.
It was terrifying to watch, and there was nothing nothing we can do.
Tossed about like a matchstick in the massive swell, it stood no chance. Eventually thrown onto rocks.
Oh, it's surfing now.
The boat broke up. Men, women and children were thrown into the swirling sea.
The seas are so rough, there was just nothing anybody could do. You know, you couldn't do anything but just stand there and watch, and you just felt so absolutely useless.
I saw children on that boat. I saw children.
Jaden Woosnam videoed the tragedy.
Women and children, yeah. Okay. I didn't see any children make it, actually.
That is what happens when a nation like Australia is lax on border policy. That is why we need a zero-tolerance approach to illegal boat arrivals. And although when former Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard knifed Kevin Rudd for the leadership in 2010, she brought back offshore detention and took a slightly stronger stance, it was too late. The people smugglers were emboldened and the boats kept coming. Now, when Kevin Rudd in turn knifed Julia Gillard and became Prime Minister again before the 2013 election, he had to do an embarrassing about-face on boat arrivals, given the situation.
People who come by boat now have no prospect of being resettled in Australia. The rules have changed. If you come by boat, you will never permanently live in Australia. This has not been an easy decision for me or my colleagues. The sight of asylum seekers being exploited by people smugglers is appalling. And the problem is likely to get worse in the future, as it is for so many countries around the world. We also have to do everything possible to protect our orderly migration system and the integrity of our borders.
Nevertheless, Labor lost the 2013 federal election, rather catastrophically, it must be said. And with the coalition government back in power under Prime Minister Tony Abbott, they brought in Operation Sovereign Borders. This was an even more stringent approach than the Pacific solution and included not only offshore processing, but boat turnbacks at sea and a guarantee that if you arrived in Australia illegally by boat, there was zero chance that you would be settled here. And guess what? It worked. The coalition did, in fact, stop the boats, as was their election promise in 2013. The detention centres were slowly but surely mostly emptied out, and the people smuggling trade to Australia was scuppered. That is, until now. See, people smugglers know that despite Labor nodding ferociously in agreement with the coalition that yes, Operation Sovereign Borders is the way to go, and yes, we've got to have a zero-tolerance approach, it's not in their blood. Check out this interview our current Prime Minister, Labor's Anthony Albanese, did on the ABC's Insiders in 2015 while he was in opposition discussing boat turnbacks.
And when we talk about boats, of course, we're talking about people on boats. I'm of the view that I would just find out, I couldn't ask someone else to do something that I couldn't see myself doing. And if people were in a boat, including families and children, I myself couldn't turn that around.
Labor's international reputation, plus the decision of the High Court in November last year that indefinite detention for those unable to be deported because they'd committed crimes was unlawful, which enabled the release of 149 dangerous non-citizens into the community, has emboldened people smugglers. Hence the fact the number of boats that have been intercepted has risen since the 2022 election, which Labor won. 0 boats in 2021, 7 boats in 2022, and 4 in 2023. And while those numbers may seem small, history shows that small numbers can lead to, without the proper settings in place, a disaster.